hit the record button, and
I'll get us
Nicole, I'll
started.
let you kick us off.
Yeah. So hi everybody. Welcome to Mightybytes' second webinar of the year. I am Nicole Hunter, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on understanding corporate digital responsibility. Few notes about housekeeping notes. Number one, this webinar is being recorded. We'll share this recording at the end of the session, along with the deck as well, I believe. Closed captioning is being provided through Otter. I don't know if we got that working, Tim.
I haven't seen it. No, that's
well,
two times. Bummer.
Well, afterwards,
we'll be able to provide a transcript afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. So that'll be available in case you are having difficulties following along. We encourage our guests to have conversations in the chat. Last webinar, it was pretty fantastic. It's a great place to share resources and links, and we can build our knowledge base together. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. You can use the Q&A feature to ask any of your questions, and I will ask them at the end. If you are having some difficulties figuring that out, I know everybody has different levels of comfort with Zoom. You can just ask them in the chat, and I'll be taking notes, so I'll catch all of those. So yeah, next slide, please. And just some brief introductions. Today on the call, we have Tim Frick, CEO of Mightybytes. I'm Nicole Hunter. I've been working with Tim for Mightybytes for a few years as a content marketing specialist, and I'll be moderating, as I said before. And we have Rob Price, our guest for today's discussion. He's the director at Alchemmy, and I wanted to ask you, Rob, do you want to tell us anything else about yourself?
Ooh, where to start? Yeah, sure. I mean, well,
the juicy bits first, please.
I don't know about that. I guess kind of the main thing to say, I've been talking about corporate digital responsibility probably for the last 4 years, and we'll come back to that during the session, no doubt. But the focus after a career in technology and digital transformation of businesses very much focused around what do we need to do as society and as corporate business within that to ensure that there are more positive outcomes for society and the planet as a whole. So we'll come back to that. I guess what else? I run and cycle. I think actually one of the things that I found kind of, especially when I talk with people in the US, is that I spend quite a lot of time on a Peloton bike, which I seem to do with quite a lot of people in the US as well, actually. So yes, technology, digital responsibility, and a bit of running and cycling. I'm
a fan of all those things as well.
That's, yeah, thank you. Me as well. Anyways, I think that's about it for me in terms of opening notes.
Sure.
I'll hand it over to Tim to get us started.
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit first about Mightybytes. We're a digital agency, and we're located in Chicago. We live to help our clients meet business and marketing goals and help them drive long-term sustainable growth. We've been doing this since 1998 when we opened up our doors. And probably most relevant to this conversation is Mightybytes is also a certified B Corp, which means we use business as a force for good. We go through a rigorous certification process to make sure that we adhere to the highest levels of social environmental performance, transparency, and accountability. We recertify every 3 years. So we've been a B Corp for about 10 years now, and we're undergoing our 5th recertification. And that is really relevant to this conversation that we're having today, because being a B Corp and using the B Impact Assessment as kind of a creative blueprint for running a better business is really kind of how we came into this whole idea of corporate digital responsibility. So Mightybytes has been focused kind of on digital sustainability for about 10 years now. So we've been really taking our work in creating digital products and services and evolving that so that we can, lessen the carbon impact and the environmental impact and improve the performance and efficiency of digital products and services. And so for me, the next evolution of that is corporate digital responsibility, which takes a step up or a bigger, broader approach. So a couple questions I have around this and that I want to pose to you, Rob, is Based on your understanding of corporate digital responsibility, do you think there's a consensus around the definition? And if so, what would you say that is?
I think there's maybe 80% similarity between the various things that we've seen defined over the last few years. Everybody tends to come at it from a slightly different perspective. So for example, I think in the definition that you've just talked about there, your background is as a digital agency in terms of delivering services in engagement with end consumers primarily, whereas somebody else might have approached it from a sustainability and an environmental perspective. Somebody else might have approached it from the impact on society, thinking about potentially the kind of changes around AI and sustained automation and what that might have in terms of evolution of people and their jobs. So we all perhaps have a different background in how we've landed here. I think everyone you've introduced when you introduced B Corp, I mean, you're right. The principles of it are very similar. It's about how do we create positive outcomes, fairer outcomes across society for all, more inclusive, more accessible. And I think for me, it comes back to what is digital, which is something that I've talked about for many years. Corporate digital responsibility for me is not about the technology. It's about using across everything that a business does, every part of a business, every function of a business, every board member of a business, the things that they do, how can they be improved? How can you have a bigger impact on planet and societal sustainability by maybe using some of the kind of mindsets, cultures, technologies that we as digital kind of evangelists, if you like, can bring. So if we're talking about environment, what are the digital technologies that we can use to have an influence on reducing emissions from the environment, not just in terms of how we measure it or how we communicate it and things like that. I think we'll talk more in terms of, I mean, what's the reference material that's out there. So this is previous hat, when I was working in ASOS and Worldline, we defined corporate digital responsibility in 2017, 2018. PwC have got people working on this in Germany. They have a definition that they've created. Michael Wade did the very often quoted article in the MIT Sloan Review last year. There's a great different definition that was produced by the Ethos Fund in Switzerland last year. So there are a number of these documents that describe CDR. And as I say, they're pretty much on the right lines, but I think a number of us in the community think maybe there's another step to just kind of create something that unifies them.
Sure. And to that end, I often see CDR, corporate digital responsibility, listed as either a cousin to or a subset of corporate social responsibility. Would you mind talking a little bit about that and kind of how those two interplay with one another?
I think there is almost a natural evolution, and often when I've talked about CDR, I've talked about, I mean, the quest to CSR took 100 years really to kind of get from concept to where it is today, almost established in organisations, people reasonably comfortable with what it is and the reporting and the difference it makes and helping society as a whole. But I think there's a big difference between reporting on it and actually doing things that are of value to help. And there's a wide remit in terms of the different organisations bring to that. CSR encompasses kind of ESG kind of reporting, for example, more recently. And I see CDR as building on CSR and building on ESG, but very much driven from actions. What are you going to do differently to have a positive impact in the execution of it, as well as being able to report? So we almost talk about a maturity model of baselining and understanding position and measurement of things that are good to measure, moving through almost philanthropy of feeling as though you're doing some positive things, to actually move through to how are you making substantive difference. And not only, I mean, if we were talking environmental responsibility, for example, not only offsetting your emissions and everything you've ever done in terms of the impact on the planet, but helping everybody else by kind of reducing the position for the planet as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that absolutely absolutely makes sense, for sure. I haven't seen a lot of definitions that are, kind of summed up in a couple sentences that really encompass the broad range of all the things that we're going to be talking about here. To that end, you mentioned Michael Wade's format and his often quoted post in MIT Sloan Management Review, the corporate responsibility in the digital area. That's the one that we've been using as kind of our framework at Mightybytes, and the kind of research that we've been doing around this. It came out April of last year. So what I thought I would do is go through, since for me it was an easy to understand framework that I could wrap my head around and say, all right, I can see how this applies to all of these areas. And I think there's also, when I read through the article, I saw some interesting ways that it could be improved upon and expanded upon. And I think that, that's going to be an ongoing, always evolving thing, that there's, we're going to realize the legal and financial ramifications of a lot of these things. And so I want to go through quickly and touch on what the kind of 4-part framework of Michael Wade's corporate digital responsibility framework is, and we kind of have a conversation about those, just so people have a general, broader understanding of that kind of stuff. So let's explore the social, economic, environmental, and technological subsets in a little bit more detail. So first one, social digital responsibility. I've been looking at it as a set of practices to improve an organization's relationships with people, communities, and society overall. So generally, like, social media comes in there, branding and communication comes in there. There's a number of things in a marketing in the worlds in circles in which we travel that definitely plays a role in the social digital responsibility, and how do you just create that kind of harmonious relationship with society as an organization. An example of this is, is this a thing from the post from the World Economic Forum about the diversity being the bridge that can cross the skills gap. There's a huge digital divide right now, and for people with ubiquitous broadband access and people without, and that has an impact on the quality of life for a lot of those people. And there's also, that's also hampering the process of digital transformation and organizations becoming truly digital native and such. So other issues that I see as part of social digital responsibility are things like fake news and the spread of misinformation and harassment and bullying online platforms. These are all really big challenges that to me fall under the social digital responsibility kind of umbrella. Rob, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, very much. I wanted to pick up a couple of things. You mentioned the digital divide. For us, we had a hypothesis that started our journey on this a few years ago, which was the digital divide is growing, because it's far more than just broadband connectivity. The kind of pace of change of technology is so great, people and businesses are struggling to keep up. So this was very much driven by, how do you bridge that? How do you kind of raise awareness? How do you kind of communicate in ways that are appropriate, are inclusive, are effective? And things like privacy, as you say, absolutely key part of that. I think the other thing, and again, just to emphasize, digital well-being was very much firmly one of our key components of that. The other aspect to kind of make was, as we were doing our work, we did a global survey and just asked people how they felt about technologies. And especially in terms of the introduction of new products, kind of what were they comfortable using and not. And this was, 2017 that we did that survey, 63 different countries, lots of kind of responses that we had back to that. There were two things that were really important in terms of rapid adoption. What were people most comfortable with? Absolute convenience. And we've seen that in terms of where iPhone kind of, it makes things so quick to access, therefore the rate of adoption is very quick. And the other one, and very relevant today, is health. People were more comfortable with technologies where it had a direct impact on health. So the whole well-being, privacy, social impact, understanding, appropriateness, absolutely core to this.
Yeah. No, I think that's really spot on. In general, getting back to the original definition of talking about using technology to benefit society, example question might be, how does your organization use digital products and services to create harmonious relationships with people, communities, society overall? And then I listed a few ideas here on the ways that potentially organizations could do this, whether you're nonprofit or a civic agency or a for-profit business and stuff. In terms of like how this impacts an organization, Rob, do you have any ideas on like kind of what the maybe unintended consequences of something like this might be, or you know, how it could adversely impact an organization if they're not paying attention to this?
I think what I've seen over the last few years is a shift in a number of areas, and people might not be talking about corporate digital responsibility in its entirety, but absolutely people have been talking about accessibility and inclusion, diversity, and the environment, especially kind of more than ever over the last year or so, kind of maybe the environmental side in terms of biodiversity, climate change, etc. So I think there is an acceleration, and of course, why is that important? Well, partly because it's the right thing to do, partly because there is research that underpins actually you can be more effective in your output as a business if you do address these things in an appropriate way. And partly, actually, it's about brand and reputational damage. If you are doing something badly wrong in the world as it is, kind of that's very visible, isn't it?
Right.
So,
Yep.
so there are compelling reasons to change, and organisations are making good progress in some aspects of this. The challenge is, of course, there is so much to do in so many kind of different spaces that how do you make enough progress fast enough? And that's where we all kind of struggle, if you like, is to prioritize the things that matter.
Sure. Yeah. And so I mentioned in the first screen in this section, you know, I often see social digital responsibility playing out through an organization's branding, through their marketing, you know, and their communications and that kind of stuff. But as you pointed out at the beginning, you know, this is kind of cross an entire organization and interdepartmental. So other than, you know, communications and marketing departments, which there are probably a lot of those folks on this call, who else might be impacted, you know, by social digital responsibility specifically?
I was hoping you weren't going to put that last very specific kind of piece on top. You know, I think that I'm going to answer it for all of it to start with, just to be slightly cheeky.
Sure.
I think the biggest challenge with a lot of this is that that's not clear at the moment. The answer, I've written quite a lot. I've talked to a lot of people on a podcast that I do on a regular basis. And the question we keep asking is who in the boardroom is responsible for these things? And the answer seems to be twofold. One is it's the CEO. And I get that in terms of leadership and direction and legal responsibility. And the other is everybody. And well, I've spent the last 5-6 years in the boardroom as Chief Operating Officer, Deputy CEO of an organisation, and I know it can't be everybody. It might be everybody in terms of everybody to be aware, everybody to be thinking about these things, but it will fall down the gaps if it's not more clearly defined than that. Right. So I think, in essence, with this, I will still say the answer is everybody. It depends on the nature of the organisation. So who's responsible for governance, who's responsible for diversity and inclusion, who's responsible for products, communication. I mean, in a sense, I'll still say it's all of them, but you're right to pick the areas that you did as the primary focus. But head of risk, whatever that's defined as, compliance, kind of people with a responsibility to be aware around brand damage also as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And so much of this, I'm looking at it through my own lens as an agency owner, and that does a lot of marketing and a lot of digital product development and stuff. So I realize that I have biases there regarding how I interpret a lot of this that other departments and other organizations may not. So going to go next to economic digital responsibility. I've been defining this as a set of practices to help organizations make more economically responsible digital decisions. So around hiring, around outsourcing, around you know, kind of sharing in economic benefits and that kind of stuff. An example of this, this is from MIT Sloan Management Review about automation. Job replacement through digitally enabled automation is one example. And this is a quote from the Pew Research benefit, but also like, paying living wages, offering better benefits, doing responsible outsourcing, and even responsible investing in terms of, not only investing in your how you invest in digital products and services from external sources, but also internally as well. So in terms of like some kind of high level bullets on how people might make more economically responsible digital decisions, question that you might ask yourself is, how do you better understand future economic ramifications of the technology choices you're making? So cross-training teams, offering professional development, hiring vendors that pay a living wage, hiring other B Corps. Obviously, knowing if you're a B Corp, you know that other B Corps are adhering to a high level of accountability and transparency. Doing things like profit sharing and contributing to open source projects, and shared ownership of the benefits of the economic elements of digital projects. And then also finally, just respecting data ownership, whether that's respecting who owns the software you're using, or respecting your users' needs or your customers' needs to, for instance, have the right to be forgotten and such. So Rob, anything I'm missing here in terms of, touching on the economic side of things?
I think you're right with all of those, and I think just to emphasize, irrespective of what people's thoughts are in terms of the impact of these technologies on jobs, the important point is there is that constant cycle of evolution and people needing to retrain, gain other skills, understand the kind of where the opportunities are for growth. So just to emphasize that. Second one is, think about it also outside the environment. I think increasingly there's terms like impact investment, social good. So
right.
So what are the economic opportunities to invest in social outcomes and the return from that? So thinking maybe different models than we've seen over the past few years, and even impact investment, evolution of capitalism almost, but still kind of those same principles, just focused on multiple returns. The other thing that I was just going to talk about was the data piece at the end. We've talked a lot, and it touches on some of the other areas. We've talked a lot about appropriate use of data, but there's still opportunity to monetize data in various other forms for economic benefit from those outside of the business as well. So what does that mean from an individual or from a community point of view, and how do you engage those parts of society with the ability to do something different that maybe they've not considered before?
That's a really good point, for sure. And any ideas of as you brought up, there's a lot of overlap in each of these, and so the data, I think data kind of is a concept that streams throughout all of them. Are there any examples that you can think of specifically on the economic side of organizations that have done things well or right?
Well, there's a really interesting one that I'm talking to and watching in the UK at the moment. Part of Edinburgh University, there's a focus around aggregating all of the payment data for the UK, anonymized, but then enabling governments and organizations and academic bodies to gain access to that through AI, ML, API connectors to deliver, well, to understand the economic position in real time across the country, especially during the pandemic, but then to be able to deliver more valuable services, whether that be improved ability to detect financial crime or fraud across kind of multiple organizational geographical boundaries, whether it be more specific kind of services being delivered to those communities. So whether it's that or another favorite example touches on the environmental piece that we'll probably come to, is the work that the UN Environment Programme are trying to do, very similar in terms of aggregation of data and then enabling governments and organizations to hook into that to be able to deliver new products and services that improve. So I can see things happening, but it's still early days to some extent.
Yeah, no, and that makes a perfect segue into our, well, as you said, our next section. And I think that, this one is obviously near and dear to Mightybytes' heart because we've been focusing on sustainable web design for so long. But it also provides an interesting dichotomy, like some of these other ones do as well, in that, good data practices and technology are going to be completely critical in solving our climate crisis and in fixing a lot of the environmental issues that we have. They also have their own set of extenuating circumstances in terms of contributing to climate change and e-waste and some of those kind of things. So I look at EDR, environmental digital responsibility, as a set of practices to help organizations better understand ecological implications of their choices, of digital choices. And oftentimes that's a thing that's not considered a lot when people are talking about digital. There's still that kind of mindset that the pixels are invisible and don't really have any kind of breadth or depth or weight. And so, this is pretty important to us in terms of the people who build digital products and services for a living. This is a post from GreenBiz on just kind of talking about like the right to repair and the ability to hold on to your phone for longer than 2 years and maybe potentially take out cameras and hard drives and modular pieces and modularize them so that the shelf life on them lasts much longer, because the e-waste is a huge problem. I mean, the millions of tons every year of e-waste that ends up in landfills and pollutes waterways and rivers and stuff like that is a huge major issue. And in talking about kind of some specific things in terms of what are things people can do when talking about environmental digital responsibility, banning planned obsolescence. Obviously, I just mentioned that. Responsible recycling and disposal practices. So making sure if you do have e-waste, how are you disposing of it? How are you making sure that it's appropriately taken apart or recycled or refurbished in some way? Designing for end of life, as well as following responsible power consumption practices, much of which the sustainable web design stuff that we work on it covers that topic. And that was also the topic of our last month's webinar. Sustainablewebdesign.org is the site that we put together. Rob, do you have any thoughts on, is there a different angle on the kind of environmental digital responsibility side that I'm not thinking about here?
No, building on what you've said, really, it's I think the most interesting one for me is helping organizations move through what they can do within their business. So I mean, yes, absolutely, the sustainable web design, data centers, buildings, the circular economy, recycling, they're all things that absolutely kind of people have been talking about, measuring their emissions, footprints, offsetting in appropriate ways, etc. I agree with. But I'm most interested in using innovative technologies to try and go above and beyond that. And it's things like, I mean, I mentioned the UN Environment Programme and what they're trying to do with their digital transformation earlier. Anyone interested in more on that, I can talk more about it in terms of, well, there are articles on the website, I've put the link in there. But other examples, I read something the other day around somebody who was capturing carbon out of the atmosphere and 3D printing coral reefs based upon that, using kind of some mechanism that enabled the recreation of the coral reefs in the oceans. Somebody else, well, Dale Vince in the UK is talking about capturing carbon out of the atmosphere to create diamonds, which I'm utterly fascinated by how that's going to be done. But it's that technology can do some amazing things, and let's not just be limited by reducing the carbon or the environmental impact of what we do with technology, but how do we utilize technology in other ways? There was another brilliant example the other day that I kind of came across, which was an entrepreneur in, I think, Rwanda, working with conservationists and blockchain providers to effectively put in place mechanisms by which you could route offsetting funds from global corporations through verifiable kind of blockchain to the guys looking after the elephants in Africa, because the value of the elephant in mitigating carbon emissions was greater than the value of its tusks. Now, again, it's utilizing technologies to be able to have an impact in biodiversity and climate change, etc. So that's the other bit I just wanted to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very strongly that even though we have been focusing ourselves internally on the environmental impact of technology, those two things have to be hand in hand. Like, you can't have one without the other. it's important to focus on the examples like you just brought up. And then as part of those projects, also think about, well, it's not a net zero impact. So what is the impact of this if we're going to do this work? Blockchain being a perfect example of, having potentially a huge environmental impact because of the amount of processing power it takes and such. So thanks for bringing that up.
I think just to kind of add as well, I think there's some really good leadership now out there in terms of what organizations are doing. Microsoft, to kind of pull out an obvious one around what they're doing in terms of carbon negative. So I see big progression in this over the last year, absolutely, and clearly, I think kind of there's a common agreement we need to do more.
Great. Last one of the section is technological digital responsibility. And I have to admit, this is the one that I struggle with the most. It's a set of practices meant to help organizations ensure that their technology solutions produce no harm. That's the way I've interpreted it based on kind of the things that I've read. But also producing no harm. I guess producing no harm and benefiting society are kind of like two sides of the same coin to me. And so I think, taking caution in the, developing digital products and services as a company that does that, I think that's a thing that we, always want to be mindful of. At Mightybytes, we're very, rigorous in the kinds of clients that we look for, the kind of projects that we want to take on, the kind of things that we will put our efforts and resources into. And that a lot of this is driven by that, example being this article from Time, a quote from, racist criminal justice procedures, predatory advertising, spread of false information. I mean, there's no shortage of the ways technology can harm society. And some of these things are intentional, some aren't, some are unintended consequences. But I think that, if you build digital products and services like we do, you want to ask yourself the question, how can we make sure that what we're building is being used for good? And then in terms of, specific things, prioritizing interpretability and transparency and like AI algorithms. And Rob, you could probably talk deeply into AI at Mightybytes. Any particular thoughts on AI is a big one, I know, that is, and you were just in a webinar on it yesterday. Want to share a little bit more on that?
Well, I think in a sense, one of the things that I see lots of conversations, lots of focus on, unsurprisingly, is AI ethics and the impact of AI. But part of me actually wants to say it's not just AI. So I tend to kind of prefer digital ethics and whether we're talking about data or AI or quantum even, in terms of kind of some of the impacts that kind of these technologies as they evolve can have. I used to do an exercise, if that's the right phrase, when I was presenting at a conference, and I would talk about the impact of technology on society, and often these conferences would be largely technologists that were attending the conference. And I say this as a technologist, I hasten to add before I say what I'm about to say. But on a scale of utopian kind of society through to dystopian society, how did people feel it was going? And almost universally, everyone huddled around the utopian end of the scale, which really surprised me. And then when I asked them if they felt that would everybody be using those technologies in positive ways, then people began to realize that yes, well, maybe somebody might not, and therefore there is always the opportunity for things to be done in a way that's dangerous or could impact in negative ways. So I think the reason I tell that story is to then think about what businesses need to do. Who is responsible in a business for doing things in an appropriate way? And of course, this has to be every business in every country all over the world, not just because it comes back to if we're going to manage it in the most effective way. And I think the biggest challenge I've got at the moment is to think what digital ethics looks like. Gartner and others say that yes, absolutely, over the next very few years, most large businesses will have the need for a digital ethics board and have people within that, internally or externally to the organization, who can help advise on the complexity of algorithms and data use and other technologies as they emerge. And of course, that is more complex than some of the things that ethics boards or people with responsibility for risk and compliance and ethics have dealt with in the past. And who's going to do that? Where's the knowledge? And where's the evidence that organizations are going to change behaviors if something is flagged as inappropriate or of concern? And therefore that's why I think this is possibly the most interesting area in terms of how we transition concept and debates and discussions and papers into behaviors and operating model and responsibility and change in business. And I think that's, and yes, we could talk about the need for unbiased AI and explainable AI and all the various forms of that, so that we have a better understanding of the decisions that the algorithms are making, and diversity in terms of the way that that's kind of acting. But actually, what's the governance look like in those organizations? Where are the people that can provide that volume? And I had a great conversation, 2 nights ago on the podcast with a guy called Tony Fish. And Tony's in the UK, but actually he sits on a digital ethics board for an Australian bank. Now, there aren't many big organizations that have got such things. So it's interesting to see and learn from those people who are delivering that in those types of organizations. I had another exchange a couple of weeks ago with the CEO of a business in India, thousands of employees, and he'd set just asked some questions, having read one of the articles that we'd published from somebody in the network in Germany. And they were around recruitment policy and how they use data, and again, we kind of gave a view based on bringing an academic perspective and a data perspective and a legal perspective to then answer some of those questions. But we need to do that at mass scale, and I think that's the interesting thing that we've got to kind of solve over the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and you should put some. I know that those 2 examples you mentioned are either on your blog or on your podcast, so make sure you put a link of those in the chat. To what you were saying a little bit earlier, are you seeing risk analysis, risk assessments, contingency plans, things like that being planned for digital projects in your world?
I think I'm beginning to hear more and more of organizations beginning to look through a lens in the work that they are doing. So, for example, an organization that is looking through a lens of decency in the work that they do. So I think it's an interesting word because it's aligned with all the things that we've been talking about: responsibility, appropriateness. Is that a decent thing to do? And that was kind of big global organization that was particularly using that. Sustainability, I was talking to an energy business very recently, and ensuring that they are absolutely looking at every program, project, whether it be technology or capital program build or whatever it might be, in terms of that impact that then has on reducing their environmental footprint, so that they were ensuring that they were making decisions in an appropriate way. So yes, in part is the answer, but at the end of the day, there's a lot more work to do across this whole piece, whether it be in digital ethics or AI ethics or data ethics or through an environmental lens, etc. I had a conversation with a great organization in Germany called Veleda, so health and beauty products, and they've done, interestingly, managed to fuse their digital transformation principles with a strong sense of purpose in terms of their desire to have a positive impact on society, with a strong sense of environmental responsibility that then led through to the work that they were doing, for example, through the supply chain around sustainable farming techniques in various kind of countries that they were then dealing with. So there are examples, but there need to be more.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great segue into kind of our last last section, and just, underscoring the importance of these things working together, and it's in organizations large and small. And you've got actually a really good post that I'm going to post a link to here in the chat on whose responsibility is it anyway, about like who needs to own these things. If we're talking about a 4-part framework that goes across an organization. You want to talk a little bit more and revisit that topic a little bit about who is the owner of either each of these or all of these?
And I think, I mean, as I said earlier, a lot of people have said it's everyone or it's the CEO. I think I want to add to it in the sense that I don't want it to be kind of considered as everyone in a senior position. It's an organization in its entirety. And I think we talk about are things driven from the top or a bottom-up approach. And for me, this is absolutely an opportunity for both of those. I do see a desire for change. I mean, the great conversation the other day I had with somebody who worked for an organization whose son was at a particular university, and the son said, don't come to the university because that organization isn't appreciated here, what you do, kind of thing. And that's just a reflection on the fact that my kids, my eldest is 18, she's just about to go to university. The decisions she will make about who she works for are driven differently from the decisions that I made 30 years ago when I came into the workforce.
Sure, absolutely.
So how organizations are going to retain that new talent as it comes into the workforce is going to be dependent on all these things that we've talked about today, because it comes back to they are the right thing to do. I think the ability to identify opportunities from everybody across the organization to promote those change agents, to enable people to innovate, to inspire, to be empowered to do things differently, in conjunction with clarity of leadership that demands change, evolution, actions, not just reporting. Yep. With an investment. I think one of the most important things actually that I've seen over the last year has been investors looking at CDR as they are doing. I mean, specific example is in Switzerland. I mentioned them earlier, the Ethos Fund. So talking to boards to understand what they are doing differently in regard to not only ESG, but CDR as well, because that's where they are then making their investment decisions for vast amounts of investment. That for me says this is different now. This is something, and so whose responsibility is it anyway? The board, but somebody's got to kind of drive it forward passionately. But also, how does everybody within an organization feel as though they have a voice to try and make a difference?
Yep, absolutely. In the B Corp community, the organizations that build kind of the impact assessment into the DNA and into the core decision making of the entire organization often tends to be the ones that are the most successful and the most efficient and the best to work for, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many levels of success that brings as well. So to that end, how do we transition this topic from a relatively esoteric concept that's happening in a few pockets around the world to something that is a rapidly or readily accepted set of practices that crosses industries, crosses company sizes, et cetera? What do you think we need to do?
And if I could answer that in one sentence, then kind of we'd be a lot further forward. Look, I think the thing that gives me so much faith is that there are, it doesn't matter whether we call things corporate digital responsibility or digital ethics or digital responsibility or the number of things, tech for good, automation for good, change for good, the things that I've heard. In principle, they are a good overlap of alignment. I think what I've seen over the last few months even is, and Tim, you've very much been part of this, there is a community across the world, across Europe, across Asia, across the US, that is beginning to talk about this more and more. Even this year, I mean, I've seen articles in China that have quoted Michael's work. I've seen Samsung declare kind of a commitment to CDR. I've seen the continued evolution in Central Europe in terms of the work that they're doing. In the UK, very few people talk about CDR, but we absolutely do talk about digital ethics, AI ethics, and environmental sustainability.
Right.
I think the more that we can connect as a community, the more that we can get commonality of the terminology that we are each using, almost a kind of almost a manifesto for CDR that we all understand and it makes sense to us all. We can identify with it, associate with it. Then it helps kind of drive forward. The challenge that I've given, and again, I wrote an article about it. I mentioned it earlier. 100 years to kind of get CSR embedded in businesses. We haven't got 100 years this time. So we got 10 years at most to kind of get massive global change for both planet and societal benefit. And I can see acceleration. The pandemic, as awful as it is, has accelerated that attention on needing to do things differently. And let's just continue to drive that forward, hopefully kind of moving beyond the pandemic as soon as we can, but drive that forward for the benefit of all.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm obviously sold on that idea. I want to make sure we give a shout out to your blog because I think it's a great resource. And I see that you've shared a couple posts from it. So it's corporatedigitalresponsibility.co.uk. Are there other resources that we haven't mentioned today that in addition to your blog that are worth giving a shout out to and making sure that we include?
I think the other one that absolutely comes to mind is there is a corporate digital responsibility community on LinkedIn. It's moderated and set up by a guy called Oliver Merks in Germany. A lot of the posts are in German, but there are increasingly more of us. And indeed, one of the core reasons behind setting up the blog was to kind of provide an English language resource to all those kind of articles that I saw being published across Europe. And we have translated a number of them and published them here. So if this is something that you are interested in, absolutely. I mean, selfishly, I would say, yes, come and engage with the blog and listen to some of the podcasts, but also join Oliver's CDR community on LinkedIn as well, because that's the best way that I've found of seeing some of the things that are happening all over the world, because kind of that's where they get reported by any number of us that are already members of that community.
Yeah, it's a vibrant group for sure. If you could leave the webinar attendees here with one takeaway, what would it be?
I think it's as simple as now's the time. We've all seen over the last year that the things that we took for granted can be kind of challenged in a heartbeat, and we've got to do things better. And whether we talk about that from a planetary point of view or a community point of view or diversity, inclusion, whatever lens we want to put on it, the time's now to drive and make a difference and change. And I think we started off by talking about the definition of CDR, and there's lots of aspects to it. And it does. I'm not saying everyone has to look at each one of these equally. Find the thing you are most passionate about and drive change and difference in that space. And as a community, then we can make a difference.
Great, thank you. We do have a Q&A session here scheduled now, and I'm going to pass the baton over to Nicole again. And if anybody has questions, drop them into the Q&A, or if you want to put them into the chat, please feel free to do that as well. Take it away, Nicole.
All right then. Thank you, Tim and Rob. That was a really interesting presentation. So I have a few questions that I can get us started off with. But if you do have questions, our audience, feel free to answer them. I'm monitoring the chat and the Q&A feature. So I think that one of the things that's kind of important when we think about implementing these CDR practices is to think about who's most impacted, like within an organization, when we implement a new practice. So I guess, for instance, if we're trying to get if we're trying to change the way that people interact with, well, I guess, I'm actually, I don't have an example.
That's
Take it
okay.
away.
No, in terms of like what just trying to dig a little bit deeper into what you were asking, and so is it about asking who's being left out if you're implementing a new procedure, for instance? Is that like who's not being included in our mix when we talk about implementing something new?
I think that's part of the question. But I guess when we're talking about like setting up new ways of running a business, we also have to think about the way the employees who are in charge of making those changes, I suppose. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is who is impacted the most by that. So, for instance, when we talk about like whose burden is it to make sure that this is happening, um, from the bottom, whose burden is it to actually like bring or to make those practices go forward?
Sure. I mean, my experience has been that it's always an ongoing, but you know, it's an evolution, and that's a continuous kind of communication goal. But Rob, I'm sure you have other thoughts and from your experience as well.
I'll probably answer it from the previous roles that I did. So when I was Chief Operating Officer within a payments business. So if I think about it from social impact, then we needed to make sure that the products that we provided to merchants, retailers, to enable people to take payment, whether it was online or whether it was in store, were done in an inclusive, accessible way that we catered for everybody, enabled anybody, whatever their situation, to be able to use those. And of course, as we all know, there are lots of standards that you need to adhere to in that. So I guess my point is there, maybe kind of the product owners need to kind of think carefully about how they are designing products, delivering products and services that do reach out to every part of society. If I was looking at it from an environmental point of view, yes, I could measure my carbon footprint, and yes, I could change energy providers, but it could equally engage all of the employees in different ways as part of that journey as well, because kind of people can think about what car do they drive, do they move to electric, what do they eat, what do they use in terms of even their coffee cups, is it a kind of reusable cup as opposed to not. So there are ways engaging kind of everybody in those kind of decisions. From a technology point of view, of course, so many of these things involve I was going to say, kind of comes back to the technologists. So the decisions that are being made across the business. But I mean, those that let me pick the data side, and this again, it was the conversation I had with Tony this week. That understanding where's the depth of experience in data in organizations, and especially at a board level, because that's kind of relatively new, isn't it? Kind of if you're a CFO, for example, I mean, the finance profession, the financial industry, worked for decades. That's well established. The concept of data in terms of governance and what should be done right or wrong, and appropriate use and ethical use, etc., that's relatively, so maybe that's more of a change, and more specifically in terms of something new at a board level. So I think it just depends. There are lots of ways that you can engage different parts of the organization dependent on the things that you're trying to achieve. What's the business strategy? How do you realize that? What's the technology strategy that aligns with that? The digital strategy that aligns with that? And how do you overlay and through those the CDR themes?
Yeah, we at Mightybytes, we do what is referred to as customer journey mapping for a lot of our clients. So we go through and help them understand what their customers are looking for from their organization, whether that's from their products or services or customer service or some sort of interaction of some sort, and help them understand how customers are feeling, and then how can you improve those interactions. And I think given this question, there might be opportunity to kind of undergo stakeholder journey mapping, exercises, in that you identify who your stakeholders are and then identify what kind of impact they could potentially have. Now all of these are typically done based on assumptions, and the power in them really comes from validating or refuting those assumptions. So for instance, if I say this person is going to be impacted in this way by this new digital product that we're going to unroll, that's my assumption of what that's going to be. I need to validate that by going to that person or some person who represents that kind of stakeholder, and really understanding whether or not that's truly the way that they're going to react to this. And that's where the kind of better product design, better service design can truly take place, in my opinion.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I had a follow-up until you said that, which was how do you kind of come up with a theory for interrogating how things will impact people? But the journey map is a really good way of getting that started.
Yeah.
And the process of validation is really important. I have a question from Neil Clark. I'll just read it verbatim. Fascinating topic. Thank you to both of you. I work for a digital agency. How have you approached this subject whilst working on client projects? Have you come up against any barriers when trying to implement these concepts within a client project that isn't necessarily a project focused on these concepts from the beginning?
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing challenge for sure. I think, in a digital agency setting, at the end of the day, the clients are paying us, and so we want to respect their decision. I think as a digital agency, we also want to be seen as trusted advisors, and so we have the opportunity to bring up these ideas and concepts, and roll them into the work that we do. And if a client decides to push back, there's not a ton we can do. We certainly want to have a harmonious relationship with our clients, so we don't want to say, nope, sorry, that's not going to be what we do. That being said, we do that a lot when the wrong kinds of clients come to us, for instance. So the clients that we work with often are, the clients that we search for are aligned with our mission as a B Corp. They're also looking to change the world in a positive way, and so oftentimes they're open to and receptive to the ideas that we bring up regarding web sustainability or digital products, in different ways, on how they might impact society. So that's not a problem for those folks, but oftentimes it really means that me as the gatekeeper, who often has the first interaction with potential customers, has to say, is this going to be a good client that's going to be amenable to the ideals that we kind of hold forth for the organization? And if it's not, then we should probably nip it in the bud right away and not waste any time. And if they seem like a good client, I can refer them to other agencies. There's plenty of other agencies around to do that, and I just did that yesterday, in fact. So I think there's a couple of different things there.
I think if I can just add a couple of more.
Sure.
I mean, with a lot of this, I kind of see it as raising awareness and nudging things slightly in the right direction. So there are times when absolutely I should say my day job, director at Alchemmy. Alchemmy is a management consultancy, business transformation as our kind of primary focus. So clearly there are going to be challenges or problems that our clients are facing that are peripherally related to the things that we've been talking about today. But in terms of using it as an overlay and helping them think about some of the consequential impacts if they were done in a different way, or indeed recognizing that some of our clients they might not use CDR as a term, but they want to kind of express and understand the impact that they have. I'm thinking particularly of one client that's very much focused in terms of the measurement of the impact they have on society from a positive point of view. How would they go about that in the work that they do? Or another client where we were helping them align the environmental impact of 700 projects and programs that they were doing to their environmental strategy. So again, they'd got the proof and the evolution being able to demonstrate tangible progress. So I think sometimes it does align. I had a conversation this week around environmental responsibility in the broadest sense, and actually CDR was mentioned, and it was seen as a kind of really interesting, that it wasn't a term that they'd heard before, really interesting, powerful addition to the core subject, which in that case was the environmental responsibility side. So I think it's, how can we use it to nudge things in the right direction, whilst recognizing, as was said by Neil and Tim as you responded, that at core they've asked for something to be done, which might not be directly kind of CDR related, but use it as an opportunity to spread the word.
Right. Yeah. Well, on that note, we are right at time. So if we didn't get to your question, I apologize. You can reach out to us via Twitter at Mightybytes, or drop us a note on the contact form on our website. And we're happy to continue this dialogue. And Rob, thank you so much for your time and insights, and for hanging out with us on a Thursday night in England. And Nicole, thanks for moderating this and moderating the questions and stuff like that. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming.
Great, thanks all.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Tim.
Thanks.